Hello, this is Kateri Smith, and this is Ignore the Bodies in the Bins, Indigenous Remains in Collections and the Resistance to Repatriation. It was given at the Bodies in Migration International Interdisciplinary Conference at the Sorbonne VALE in Paris on June 20th, 2026. This paper examines a form of migration that is rarely discussed. Indigenous ancestors were removed from their communities and transported into museums, universities, and private collections. In America, this covered the time from the discovery of Americas. Indeed, Columbus took remains and bodies back to Europe, it is believed on the first voyage, up until the present day. This also has comparisons with global indigenous communities worldwide. Indigenous remains in museums are not static objects, they are displaced bodies, they are ancestors. Their removal from burial grounds, communities, and territories constituted a forced migration enabled by colonial violence. This continued displacement represents not only a physical migration, but an ongoing colonial relationship where institutions claim authority over indigenous land and dead. Repatriation can therefore be understood as a form of return migration that restores relationships among people, place, and sovereignty. While this paper will largely focus on the United States, the underlying questions of authority, possession, and repatriation extend well beyond its borders. My key arguments are as follows: that there are over 100,000 indigenous ancestors in U.S. collections not made available for repatriation. There's a further 100,000 plus made available but have not been returned. The resistance to this represents continuing colonial structures. Repatriation is a matter of sovereignty, dignity, and justice, and that repatriation is a form of return migration which restores the dignity of indigenous ancestors. The scholar Patrick Wolfe stated that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. This is an example of the structure. The retentions and resistance to the return of indigenous ancestors in collections represents this continuing exercise of colonial sovereignty over indigenous extraction, migrations not of agency, but which reflect the ongoing and historically unequal power relationships which mirror forced migrations of indigenous people during the reservation period and go directly against many indigenous burial practices and customs. Museums therefore become sites where colonial authority persists through the control, classification, and immobilization of the dead. It is a continuation of these unequal power structures that deny indigenous authorities over their own dead and over traditional pre colonized religious practices. Here we see the areas where remains are supposedly taken from. Again, these are self reported. The white indicates regions where reportedly no remains were taken from. The the green means closer to 100% have been made available for repatriation, while the darker the orange reflects where less items are made available for repatriation. This is from ProPublica and is only items which are covered by NAGPRA, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It, well, why were they taken? Why are there indigenous remains in collections? Well, for one, this is due to looting. Here we have a 1930s picture of Lear Howell and his wife. The Howells were one of the looters of spiral mounds in Oklahoma, indicated by the big orange spike in the sea of blue just above Texas. This sites and sites like it were largely protected despite a 1906 Antiquities Act, which designated native remains as federal property, but largely these were unenforced. Howell here has what we would term grave goods or associated funerary objects. From 1868, when the first order of the collecting of human remains, unethically by the Surgeon General, for the Army Medical Museum, which we see a picture of here, to 1906, there were largely no laws covering the taking of Indigenous remains. It is interesting to note that the Surgeon General's order did not only cover Indigenous remains, it covered remains as new as the Civil War, which ended in 1865, as well as recent remains from both enslaved and free African Americans and anyone who potentially has a interesting physiology. Other than these two acts, largely the next important act was the 1990 Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, which was introduced after over a decade of work by scholars. This was the first federal and comprehensive law which mandated the return of Native American cultural items, which include human remains, funeral objects, such as the items we saw the Howell family selling, and Native American sacred objects. Though until 2024, it did not mandate a concept of inheritance and descent in the way many indigenous people do. For example, the adoptions in the Tanai system among the native Hawaiians and the familial relationships of, let's say, the importance of uncles in Plains tribes. Even with this and the continued revisions, NAGPRA has two huge flaws. The first of it is that it only covers institutions which receive federal funds. If an institution or private collection does not secure federal funds, it is not subject to NAGPRA, which means if they can fund themselves without federal funding, they do not have to fall under any of this. And two, that in the first 22 years of the Act, only 20 institutions have been fined for noncompliance. These institutions had an average fine of $2,955. That's equal to a decent day at a relatively small museum's gift shop. The resistance from an indigenous perspective and a tribal perspective largely is due to the fact that it puts an undue burden on the tribes. Many are facing more immediate threats. Many offices, which also handle NAGPRA claims, also are in charge of things such as pre contact archaeological sites, industrial claims, which could impact them, pollution issues to the sites, as well as libraries, cultural museums, and displays, contacts by multiple people, including other tribes, as well as things like festivals, feast days, powwows, and the like. They are under extreme time pressure and largely are not fully staffed for the amount of work as every government agency is facing. Smaller museums are also on these time constraints, and grants, which were supposed to be made available, aren't always made available. Even if they are willing, they're sometimes not able to dedicate the funds or the staff to this work. Despite this, many museums have made good efforts to become compliant or are already compliant. The issue is that there are institutions which actively resist. They take advantage of the fact that there are no NAGPRA inspections. There's no officer coming to make sure you self reported correctly or that you are actually making the processes you have to do. And the fines, as we saw, are not really going to force them to do this. Secondly, until 2010, so the first 20 years of this law, they were simply able to label remains as culturally unidentifiable. This would reduce their need to do anything, as culturally unidentifiable human remains were not subject to NAGPRA. Now, culturally unidentifiable human remains and associated funeral objects are able to be repatriated with a somewhat convoluted system. However, this rule does not cover unassociated funerary objects or cultural items. And we have a case study with the Dixon Mounds, part of the Illinois State Museum. This was their exhibit of the Burial Mound, the oldest 248 burials on the site. It was part of the Middle Mississippian culture, which ranged from the Ohio River Valley into northern Alabama, about the size of the UK. Cahokia, a site which is now under East St. Louis across from the Gateway Arch, was the central community and lasted until colonization by Europeans. And they are the direct ancestors of the Muskogee Creek, Choctaw, Caddo, Chickasaw, among other tribes. These ancestors were displayed like this until 1992. Though we only see the burial mound of 248 burials, there is believed to be over 3,000 on the site. In the initial inventory, 98.4% of these remains were found to be culturally unidentifiable, therefore not subject to NAGPRA. This is in addition to the guidelines of the Illinois State Museum, which stated that all of these 3,000 plus graves were not subject to NAGPRA as they were buried prior to the 1673 arrival of Europeans to the state. Luckily, Dixon Mounds has made efforts to both increase tribal involvement since then and have worked to rebury and or return ancestors which were in collections or on display. This largely was by including Indigenous staff as well as younger staff, which were educated after NAGPRA. While NAGPRA created the legal framework, many European institutions rely on discretionary policies rather than legal obligations. This reflects a significant tension between museum ownership and indigenous sovereignty in the US and elsewhere. For example, the British Museum has a policy on human remains. This is not only indigenous remains, but any human remains in their collection. If the remains are less than 100 years old, the claimant has to have a direct, close genealogical link and get releases from the other potential claimants. So, if they had my great grandfather, for example, I would have to prove that he was my great grandfather, so adoptions would not count and would possibly immediately disqualify me. Then I would have to find my great aunt, her daughters, their children, their great and now great great grandchildren, in addition to my side of the family, my mother, grandfather, and uncle. Then I would have to basically prove that they didn't have a claim on the remains or that they default to me their claims. This is hard to do, especially in families which have much more than two people for generation, unlike mine. If the remains are over 100 years old, so let's say my great grandfather's mother, I would have to prove that there was a cultural continuity with the remains. which even the British Museum admits is hard, if not nearly impossible. So, for example, she was Greek from Izmir in the former Ottoman Empire in what is now Turkey. All of the people who would make these claims are second or third generation Americans. They could easily deny it, saying that a Greek from the Ottoman Empire does not have the cultural continuity with second and third generation Greek Americans. Therefore, they could keep the remains. And this is at a discretion of the trustees. Unmodified remains are subject to this. Any modified remains are simply unable to be repatriated according to this policy. Even with these provisions, they can evoke the British Museum's Act of 1963, which prohibits them from deaccessioning any item unless with an Act of Parliament. The two most well publicized remains, which have been repatriated according to this policy, are in 2005 and 2008. There have been multiple efforts at repatriating, particularly Maori and Indigenous Australian remains, which the British Museum says that they are modified and therefore unable to be repatriated in the years since. Other UK museums are more or less stringent on this policy, but since the British Museum is the premier institution, many model their returns policy based on this. Other nations are also seeing repatriation efforts, though more or less controversy. This is one of the largest, the reburial of 94 Skolt Sami or Eastern Sami ancestors. These were taken by the University of Oslo and bought for less than €1 per person in 1915 from a Skolt Sami man, an instance of intracultural violence. He was not a reigning member of the community, and therefore he did not actually have the permission to take these bodies. He simply lived close to the cemetery and was, in some records, the caretaker of the cemetery, or he owned land around the cemetery. Even though these are from the pre Christian period, in a time where they were potentially facing issues with their non conversion, and the associated grave goods point to a pre Christian burial period, they were buried according to the Orthodox rites, not traditional Sami funerary practices. This was a decision by the diocese as well as a post Christianized community. This return was only enabled through a cobbling together of various heritage policies and laws, advocacy from the Sami parliament and community, and a willingness from the university to return these remains. This is, again, not a law. This was discretionary, and which many worldwide and international policies actually fall under discretionary, not legal. In conclusion, Indigenous ancestors continue to be held despite legal protections. Colonial assumptions are a reason for this and a resistance for the repatriation of remains. Compliance alone is insufficient without institutional accountability, and that repatriation is an act of restorative justice and Indigenous sovereignty, which centers Indigenous sovereignty over their own ancestors. And I leave you with this. The question is not whether institutions possess Indigenous ancestors, it is whether institutions have the right to continue possessing them. Thank you.